The KTH Empire had never lost a war. Not. In 4,000 years, not once, they had. Fought 47 wars across 6 star systems and won every single one. Some wars lasted decades, some lasted weeks. It did not matter, the outcome was always the same. The KE moved and broke things, and the other side eventually stopped having the ability to resist. It was not cruelty. The K did not think of themselves as cruel, they thought of themselves as efficient, supreme. Commander Vosarak stood on the observation deck of the flagship Eternal Dominion and looked at the small blue planet below. It had a single moon, a thin atmosphere, oceans covering most of its surface. It was by any standard the KTH used to measure such things. Unremarkable report, he said. Admiral Rental stepped forward. She was tall, even by K standards, with the gray-green skin and flat black eyes common to the upper military caste. She held a data pad in both hands and read from it without looking up. The planet is called Earth. The species calls itself human. Population approximately 8 billion. Technological classification Class 4. Pre-interstellar, they have achieved basic orbital flight, limited artificial satellites and early fusion energy, no. FTL capability, no energy shields, no. Directed energy weapons of meaningful scale. She paused. Their military uses chemical propellant projectiles and explosive devices. Some of their more advanced units use ERLST, electromagnetic rail systems, nothing we have not seen before from a Class 4 species. Vasarak looked at the planet for a long moment, and they refused the treaty. They did. He turned from the window. Read me what they said. Renal cleared her throat. She had read this message 3 times already and still found it difficult to process. The message from their governing body. They call it the United Nations Security Council, reads as follows. She held the pad up. The terms of the KTH sovereignty agreement are rejected in full. Earth is not a territory available for colonial designation. We suggest the KTH Empire reconsider its position. We will not be asking again. Silence on the bridge. Then someone in the back made a sound. That was the K equivalent of a laugh. Then another. Within a few seconds, the entire senior staff was doing it, and Vasarak let them. He understood the reaction. He almost shared it. We will not be asking again. 8 billion creatures on a single planet with chemical propellant weapons and the nerve to address the K Empire as though they were equals, as though there was a negotiation happening, as though the treaty had been an offer they could decline. It had not been an offer. Send the standard response, Vasarak said. Inform them that non-compliance results in pacification. Give them 48 of their hours. He walked away from the window. They will comply or they will not. Either way, we move forward in 2 days. The message arrived at the UN Security Council chamber at 3:14 in the morning. Geneva time. Secretary General Amara Ozibansu was already awake. She had not slept in 31 hours. Around the long table sat the permanent members of the Security Council and 12 military advisors, most of them in rumpled suits and expressions that had long ago moved past fear into something flatter and harder. She read the KTH response aloud. The room was very quiet. Then General Marcus Webb, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of the United States, said, "Well, they took the bait." Amara looked at him. "General, they're moving in 2 Days, that's what we needed. He leaned back in his chair. He was a large man, silver-haired, with the kind of face that had stopped being surprised by anything. Roughly 20 years ago, Phase 1 launches. In 18 hours, we'll be ready. You keep saying that. I keep meaning it. Amara set the message down on the table. Outside the chamber windows, Geneva was dark and quiet, normal, ordinary. 8 billion people on this planet going about their lives, most of them still unaware that 412 KE warships were sitting in high orbit waiting. She thought about that number, 412, when the intelligence had first come in 3 months ago, when the first contact signal had been decoded and the nature of the message understood. She had put that number in front of every military leader on the planet and asked them what it meant. General Webb had said it means we need to move fast. He had not said we cannot win. He had not said we should surrender. He had looked at the number, and then he had looked at her, and then he had said they needed to move fast. She had asked him why he was not afraid. He had said, "Oh, I'm terrified," but fear doesn't change the math. She had not fully understood what he meant until 3 weeks later, when the first briefings came in, when she sat in underground rooms and watched presentations that should not have been possible from a species that had never left its own solar system, when she started to understand that the last 60 years of human military development had not gone in the direction the rest of the world thought it had gone. The KTH had looked at humanity and seen a Class 4 species. They had not been wrong exactly. They had just been looking at the wrong things. High orbit K flagship, 41 hours later, the attack began at dawn local Earth time. The KTH preferred dawn strikes. There was something psychologically effective about them. Even across species, the sun coming up and war arriving simultaneously, it tended to paralyze. 200 warships broke from formation and began their descent. Orbital bombardment. First standard procedure: disable major population centers, government infrastructure, military command nodes, then surface insertion teams, then the occupation framework. The whole process took between 72 and 96 hours for a Class 4 planet. Vossarek watched from the observation deck. The first strike group reached the upper atmosphere. Then his communications officer turned from her. "Station Commander, we are detecting." She stopped, looked at her screen again. "We are detecting launch signatures from the surface, multiple sites. Simultaneously missiles," Vassarek said. He was not concerned. He had seen this before. Class 4 species occasionally managed to get something into orbit with enough velocity to be annoying. His shields would handle it. Standard point defense response. Her voice had changed slightly. The count is another pause. 4,216 individual launch signatures, and climbing the bridge went quiet. "That cannot be right," Admiral Renault said. "I am reading it correctly." Vozarek turned from the window to look at his screens. The signatures were there, not missiles in the traditional sense. The heat profiles were wrong. The velocity curves were wrong. The trajectories were wrong. These were not going up in the way things went up when a primitive species tried to defend itself. They were going up with purpose, with coordination, with the kind of dispersal pattern that required significant computation and planning. "What are those?" he said. Nobody answered immediately. Then the first of them reached his forward ships. The device that hit the Keth spear of morning was roughly the size of a ground vehicle. It had been built in a facility 300 m below the Nevada desert, along with 412 identical units over the course of 4 years. It contained no explosive material. It did not need any. It hit the spear of morning at 0.003%. The speed of light. At that velocity, mass becomes the weapon. The math is very simple and very final. The spear of morning had shields rated to handle any known Class 4 weapon system. Kinetic impactors at that velocity were not a known Class 4 weapon system. They were not a weapon system anyone had ever encountered from a species that had not yet achieved interstellar travel, because achieving that kind of velocity from a planetary surface required an understanding of physics that a Class 4 species should not have had. The spear of morning came apart. Then the second wave hit. Vozarek stood on his bridge and watched his forward line dissolve. Not retreat, not fall back, dissolve. Ship after ship registering catastrophic structural failure. In the span of minutes, the projectiles kept coming, thousands of them. His point defense systems were handling some, the ones they recognized as threats, the ones that moved in patterns the targeting AI had been trained to intercept. But the humans had apparently anticipated this. Some of the projectiles moved in completely irregular patterns, not random. Irregular, deliberately unpredictable. His targeting systems kept adjusting, and the adjustments kept being wrong. Pull back the forward line, he ordered. Get them out of the impact corridor, sir. We're losing communication with. Pull them back. 31 ships managed to break from the corridor. 41 did not. In 11 minutes, the KTH Empire lost more ships than it had lost in the entirety of its previous 47 wars combined. Vozarek stood in the silence that followed and stared at his screens. The projectile signatures were tapering off. The humans had apparently run through their first wave. His remaining ships were intact. He had 371 warships still functional. He breathed. Report. Total losses 41. Vessels destroyed, 17 with significant structural damage. Estimated casualty count. The officer's voice was very flat. Approximately 60,000 K personnel. The number sat in the room like something physical. 60,000 in 11 minutes from a Class 4 species with chemical propellants and no FTL capability. Vosk looked at his communications officer. Open a channel to the surface. She did. He stared at the screen and chose his words with great care. This is Supreme Commander Vozarek of the KTH Imperial Fleet. You have demonstrated an unexpected military capability. In recognition of this, the Empire is willing to revisit the terms of the sovereignty agreement. Ceasefire is. The channel opened. On screen appeared a human woman, middle-aged by the look of her dark skin, gray-streaked hair, a plain suit. She looked like someone who had not slept in 2 days and did not particularly care that she looked that way. She looked at him with an expression he did not have a word for. Calm was close, but it was not calm exactly. It was the face of someone who was not surprised, who had expected to be here in this conversation at this moment and had already decided what they were going to say. She said, Supreme Commander, I am Secretary General Amara Onsu. I represent Earth. She paused. That was our test launch. Vozarek did not respond. He was not sure what response was appropriate. We used it to calibrate targeting data and evaluate your point. Defense response time. She folded her hands on the table in front of her. We now have everything we need. I strongly recommend you do not send your ships any closer to Earth. Another pause, but of course, she said, that is your decision. The channel closed. Vosarak stood very still. Around him, his bridge crew did not move, did not speak. The screens showed 371 ships still in formation. He had overwhelming numbers. He had firepower that should have been sufficient to pacify 40 planets of this type. He was by every rational measure winning this engagement. He looked at the planet below, blue, quiet, a single moon. He thought about the words she had used. Test launch. He thought about the 41 ships that were no longer on his screens. He thought about the fact that whatever he had just watched, that coordinated, precise, devastatingly effective first strike had been described by the leader of this species not as an attack, as a test, and for the first time in his 40-year military career, Supreme Commander Vos Eric felt something he did not immediately recognize. It took him a moment to name it. Fear. The KTH Council of 12 met in emergency session 6 hours after the battle. They met on K Prime, which was 11 light years from Earth. The signal lag was significant enough that the full report had taken time to arrive, and during that time the Council had been operating on incomplete information. Some of them had been asleep when the first alerts came in. Some had been at ceremonial functions. One had been in the middle of a meal. None of them were doing any of those things now. High Counselor Marin Vos sat at the head of the long black table and read the report. For the third time, the room was circular with high walls and no windows. 12 seats, 12 faces, all of them carrying the same expression. 41 ships, said Counselor Drethnell. He said it the way someone says a number they do not believe. 41 confirmed destroyed. 17 others with damage that will require docking. Marin Vos set the report down. In 11 minutes from a class 4, yes. Drethnell leaned back. He was the oldest member of the council, which meant he had lived through more of the Empire's history than anyone else in the room. He had sat in this chamber for the briefings before all 47 previous wars. He had never once sat in a briefing that felt like this one. As Commander Vosik responded to their ceasefire communication, he acknowledged it. He has not yet moved his fleet. Marin Vos looked around the table. He is waiting for direction from us. Good. Counselor P. Throw, who headed the military intelligence division, leaned forward. She was younger than most of the others, sharp-featured, known for never wasting words, because what I am about to tell you is going to require us to rethink everything we thought we knew about this species. She pulled up a holographic display in the center of the table. Data cascaded across it, maps, timelines, facility locations, production numbers. What you are looking at, she said, is 3 years of deep surveillance data that we have been analyzing since initial contact with Earth. At the time, our analysis team classified this data as low priority because nothing in it seemed inconsistent with a Class 4 civilization. We were looking for things we recognized. We were not looking for things we did not know to look for. She highlighted a series of underground facility markers across several continents. These structures were built over the past 60 years. We identified them but categorized them as mining operations, transportation, infrastructure, and energy generation. We were not wrong about their surface function, but we missed what was happening below. She brought up cross-section diagram of one of the facilities. It went down, far down. Humans have been building a parallel military infrastructure for 6 decades. Not in response to us, they did not know about us 60 years ago. They built it because of each other, because their own history taught them that the next war was always coming, and it was always going to be fought by whoever prepared the longest and the deepest. Drethnell said they built it against themselves. Yes, and then we showed up. Pethro's expression was difficult to read, and they redirected it. She pulled up a new set of numbers. The kinetic impactor program they used in this engagement required a precision manufacturing capability we did not know they had. The targeting algorithms required a computational infrastructure we did not know they had. The launch coordination across 4,000 separate sites required command and control network we did not know they had. How did we miss this? Someone asked. Because we were not looking for it in the right places. We looked at their public military, their armies, their navies, their air forces. We looked at their satellites and their nuclear stockpiles. We graded them on everything we expected a Class 4 species to have developed. She paused. We did not account for the possibility that a Class 4 species could develop in a completely non-standard direction due to spending 3,000 years at war with itself. Silence. 3,000 years, Marinvos said. Their recorded military history goes back approximately 5,000 years. Active large-scale warfare for most of it. They have never in their recorded history had a period of global peace lasting more than 75 years. Pethro looked at the table. Every other species we have encountered that developed to Class 4 status did so after achieving some form of planetary unity, or at least prolonged regional stability. The humans did not. They developed in a state of perpetual conflict. Everything they built knowing someone else on their own planet was trying to build something better to destroy it. They evolved their weapons technology in a live competitive environment. Drethnell said for millennia. Yes, more silence. This one lasted longer. Marinvos looked at the display, the facility cross-sections, the production numbers, the targeting data from the engagement. What else do they have? Petra did not answer immediately. Counselor Marinvos said, "We don't know." Petra said, "That is the honest answer. We know what they used. Today, we do not know what they chose not to use, and based on what we have just learned about the gap between what we thought they had and what they actually deployed." She let the sentence end there. It did not need finishing. Vasarak received the Council's orders 12 hours after the battle. Hold position. Maintain orbital distance. Do not engage. Wait for diplomatic team. He read the orders twice, then he looked out at his fleet, still in formation. Above the blue planet, 371 ships, the largest fleet the Empire had deployed outside of a border conflict in 200 years, enough firepower to crack the crust of a moon, and they were being told to wait. He understood why. He did not like it, but he understood it. The 41 empty spaces in his formation were a very clear argument. He called his senior staff together. "We hold," he said, "no aggressive posturing, no targeting locks, no communications that could be interpreted as threatening." He looked around at the faces in the room. They were all experienced commanders, all decorated veterans, all right now. Very carefully, not showing what they were thinking. Questions, he said. Admiral Renal said, "Sir, do we know what else they have?" No, she nodded. That was the answer she expected. The Secretary General said the launch was a test run, said a younger officer, Commander VTH Dan, who had joined the fleet 6 months ago and had never seen a real engagement before today. He was doing a reasonable job of keeping his voice level. What does that mean exactly? Were they calibrating accuracy, testing our defenses, or yes, Vosrik said. Than blinked. Sir, all of it. They were doing all of it. They engaged us for the purpose of learning. Every ship we lost was data for them. He said it plainly, because there was no other way to say it. They chose what to show us. The room processed that. They let 41 of our ships die to collect information, Renal said. They destroyed 41 of our ships. Whether they could have destroyed more, I cannot say. Whether they deliberately held back, I cannot say. But based on what we saw, the precision, the coordination, the behavior of their targeting systems, they were not operating at their limit. He paused. That is my assessment. I could be wrong. I do not think I am. No one argued with him. We hold position. He said again. We wait on the surface, in the underground chamber, 300 mi below Geneva. Amara Oibansu was doing something that surprised everyone around her. She was sleeping, not deeply. She was on a cot in a side room off the main chamber, and she had left instructions to be woken if anything changed, but she was sleeping, which was more than most of her staff had managed. General Webb found her there when he came to give her the update, and he stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her before he knocked on the frame. She was awake before the second knock. They're holding position, he said. Council communication intercepted and decoded. They're pulling back their aggressive posture. Diplomatic team incoming. She sat up and ran a hand over her face. How long? Estimated 48 hours to reach orbit. She nodded. She had expected this, not this fast. She had planned for 72 hours of continued standoff before the KE decided that whatever humanity had in reserve was not worth finding out about. But 48 hours was not surprising. The KTH were efficient, and efficiency extended to recognizing when the cost-benefit analysis of a war had changed. Phase 2, she said. Webb pulled up a tablet and handed it to her. Teams are already moving. The 4 facilities in the Northern Hemisphere will be active and detectable within 24 hours. We want them to see it before the diplomatic team arrives. Good. She stood, straightened her suit jacket, and looked at the tablet. Phase 2 was not another weapons deployment. Phase 2 was something more subtle, and she thought considerably more important. Phase 2 was letting the Keth see the rest, not all of it, not even most of it, but enough to make the conversation that was coming go in the right direction, enough to make the Keth diplomatic TAC team arrive already doing the calculation in their heads, already asking themselves the question she wanted them to be asking before she sat down across from them. How deep does this go? Because the answer to that question was something she was not going to tell them. Not today, maybe not ever. The 41 ships had been a demonstration. What came next would be a negotiation. And in every negotiation she had ever been part of, in 30 years of international diplomacy, of sitting across from people who had more power, and more weapons and more resources than. The other side of the table, the most powerful thing you could bring to the table was not what you showed, it was what you didn't. The KE diplomatic shuttle descended through Earth's atmosphere 2 days later. Ambassador Kale Red had been briefed extensively on the way. He had read every file the intelligence division could put together. He had reviewed the battle data. He had looked at the facility scans, the production estimates, the revised threat assessments. He had studied images of the Secretary General, read transcripts of her speeches, reviewed her history in international negotiations. He was by any measure prepared. He was not prepared for what the humans had done in the 48 hours since the battle, because as his shuttle descended, as his sensors passively swept the landscape below, he saw them. 4 massive installations, none of which had been active during the battle, all of which were now running at full power. The energy signatures were extraordinary, enormous, the kind of output that implied infrastructure on a scale that should have taken a class 4 civilization another century to build. They had not been hidden, they were fully visible to his sensors. They were not even trying to conceal them, they were showing him. He sat in his seat and looked at the readouts and thought about what his intelligence division had said about the underground facilities, about the parallel infrastructure, about 60 years of development in a competitive live fire environment. And then he thought about the Secretary General's face on the screen 2 days ago. That was our test launch. Calm, unhurried, no performance of threat or strength, no posturing, just a statement, just a fact. He landed at the designated site, the city called Geneva, neutral ground. By human custom, there were no weapons visible. There was a line of human officials waiting for him in the gray morning light, and there at the front of the line was the Secretary General herself. She shook his hand, a human greeting gesture he had been briefed on. Her grip was firm, her expression was the same one he had seen on the screen. That particular form of calm that was not passivity, that was something much more deliberate. Ambassador, she said. Thank you for coming, Secretary General. He said, I hope we can reach an understanding. She looked at him for a moment, and he had the unsettling sensation that she was not listening to what he said so much as watching to see if he meant it. I think we can, she said. I think we will. She turned and led him inside. Behind them, 4 energy installations pulsed on the horizon. Kale did not look back at them. He did not need to. The number was already in his head, turning over and over, not letting go. They had deployed 4,000 projectiles in the first wave. Those 4 installations each appeared capable of producing approximately that many. Again, each he walked into the building. He was very, very good at negotiation. He was going to need to be. Negotiation lasted 9 days. Kale had been in difficult negotiations before. He had represented the K Empire in 17 formal diplomatic engagements. He had sat across from species that were angry, species that were desperate, species that were calculating. He had sat across from onesie species that had tried to bribe him mid-session with technology they could not afford to give away. He had never sat across from someone like Amara Obansu. She did not posture, she did not make speeches, she did not remind him even once of the 41 ships. She did not mention the 4 installations on the horizon. She sat Across the table with a small team, 2 military advisors, a legal specialist, translator, and she negotiated as though this was a routine trade agreement. Between equals, that was the unsettling part. The equals part, the KTH Empire, had over 400 member species under its governance. Many of them had negotiated their own entry under varying degrees of pressure. None of them had ever negotiated as equals. The framework of Keth diplomacy was built around the assumption that one side had power and the other side had the option to comply or face consequences. The language of all their standard agreements reflected this. The treaty structure reflected this. Amara rejected the standard treaty structure on the first day, not aggressively. She simply said, this framework assumes a colonial relationship. We're not here to discuss a colonial relationship. I suggest we start fresh. She placed a document on the table. Her team had drafted it overnight. Kale read it carefully. Then he read it again. Then he sent a copy to the council via encrypted channel and waited 6 hours for their response. The council's response was brief: assess her limits, find out what she will not compromise on, report back. He spent the next 8 days finding out. The answer he eventually concluded was nothing fundamental. She would negotiate language, timeline, specific terms, practical arrangements. She would not negotiate the premise. The premise was not a subject for discussion. Earth was sovereign. Humans were not a subject species. Any agreement that implied otherwise would not be signed. On the 5th day, Councillor Drethnell, present via communication link from Keth Prime, asked to speak directly to the Secretary General. He was the oldest member of the council. He had in his long career personally overseen the incorporation of 11 species into the empire. He told her that the KET were willing to offer humanity a classification upgrade, Class 6 status, full resource rights, representation in the lower governance body, limited self-administration. She thanked him for the offer. Then she told him that the humans were not interested in any classification within the K system at any level because the K system presumed key authority over the classified species, and that presumption was the problem, not the specific terms attached to it. Drethnell looked at her for a long moment. You understand, he said slowly, that the empire has been building for 4,000 years. You have been in space for less than 100. The gap between what we have and what you have is narrowing, she said faster than you'd expect. She did not say it as a threat. She said it as a fact. The same way she said everything. Drethnell went quiet. After the session ended, Kale Rhett sat in his quarters and wrote his daily report to the council. He wrote it carefully. He chose every word with intention. He was trying to convey something that was difficult to convey in standard diplomatic language, which was built around concepts like leverage and compliance and acceptable loss. He was trying to convey that the Secretary General did not seem to believe she needed the negotiation to succeed. She was here. She was negotiating in good faith. She clearly preferred a peaceful outcome, but she held the whole enterprise lightly, the way you hold something when you know you have other options and you're choosing this one because it's better, not because it's necessary. He had never felt that from the other side of a table before. He was not sure the council would understand it. When they read his report, he was not sure he fully understood it himself. On the seventh day, General Webb joined the table. He sat at the far end of the human side, said almost nothing, and spent most of the session reading from a tablet. This was Kale Red had learned a negotiating technique the humans sometimes used, put the person with the most information in the room without giving them a speaking role, let the other side wonder what they're reading. At the end of the session, as everyone was leaving, Kale Red passed close to Webb's end of the table. He glanced at the tablet. Webb didn't move to conceal it. It appeared to be a logistics document, supply chains, production schedules, numbers in long columns. Webb looked up, made eye contact. Ambassador, he said, General, good session today. Kale Red looked at the tablet one more time. He couldn't read the specific figures, but the structure of the document was clear enough. The layout, the scale, the number of line items. He had seen enough military logistics documents in his career to recognize one. Yes, he said, good session. He walked out. In his quarters that night, he added a line to his report. The humans are continuing production. Whatever they are building, they did not pause it for this negotiation. On the 9th day, they reached an agreement. It was not what the council had sent KL to achieve. It was not close to what the council had sent him to achieve. He had been sent to acquire a colonial designation for Earth with favorable resource extraction terms and a minimal military presence arrangement. He was returning with something that looked on paper like a mutual non-aggression pact between sovereign equals with a framework for future diplomatic engagement and a trade clause that was entirely optional for the human side. The council was not going to be pleased. He signed it anyway because the alternative was going back to the council and telling them that the negotiation had failed, and then explaining what happened when the Keth tried to take what they wanted by force. And that report would be worse. Amara signed on behalf of Earth. She had a delegation of 12 heads of state present for the signing, which he had not been told about in advance. They appeared from an adjoining room, filed in, stood behind her as she signed. An honor guard of human soldiers flanked the room. The soldiers were armed. Their weapons were not the chemical propellant systems from the intelligence files. Kale Red had been briefed enough to recognize that whatever they were carrying, it was something newer, something that had not been in the files. He noted this. After the signing, there was a brief reception, human custom. He stood with a glass of something that tasted like plant matter fermented badly and watched the room. Webb was there talking to one of the other military figures, and they were both at some point looking at him, not with hostility, with something more clinical, the way you look at something you're trying to understand. Amara appeared at his shoulder. Thank you, she said. I mean that genuinely. This was out my hoped for Earth, he said. Yes, and hopefully for the Keth as well. In the long run. She looked at him with that expression again, the calm one, the one he couldn't fully read. We're not your enemy, Ambassador. We were never interested in being your enemy. We just needed you to understand that being your subject wasn't the only alternative. He looked at her. May I ask you something? Of course. The installations on the horizon. He nodded toward the windows, toward the general direction of the northern horizon. When did you build them? She did not hesitate. The first one was finished 14 years ago. Others were completed within the last decade, and you powered them up 2 days before this negotiation began. Yes, why? She looked at him for a moment, not calculating, not deciding how much to say. She seemed to already know, because you needed to come here already asking the right question, she said, not can we take this planet by force. You'd already answered that one. The question we needed you asking was, how much more is there? He was quiet, and he said she smiled. It was a small smile. It did not reach the kind of warmth he associated with a smile used for reassurance. It was more like the smile of someone who knows the answer to the question but is giving you the courtesy of finishing the thought yourself. There's more, she said. She walked away to speak to someone else. Kret stood there with his glass of badly fermented plant matter and looked out the window. Installations pulsed on the horizon 3 km away, massive, visible, deliberate. He thought about the report he was going to write. He thought about the 41 ships. He thought about the phrase test launch and what it meant if it was true, and what it implied about everything humanity had not yet chosen to show. He thought about a species that had spent 5,000 years at war with itself and emerged from it, not broken, not exhausted, but refined, sharpened, turned into something that looked like a Class 4 civilization from the outside and was something else entirely from the inside, something the KE did not have a classification for, something he thought that the KE were going to need to start thinking about very carefully. The news of the agreement reached the Galactic Senate 3 weeks later. The Galactic Senate was not a KE institution. It was a body that had existed for over 2,000 years, predating the KTH Empire itself, comprising representatives from 67 independent and semi-independent civilizations. The KTH held significant influence within it, but did not control it, and several of the member species had their own concerns about K expansion that they had been diplomatically quiet about for a long time. When the news arrived that Earth had refused incorporation, fought back and signed a non-aggression pact as a sovereign equal, the Senate did not explode into noise. It went very quiet. Then slowly the messages started coming in, not to the K, to Earth, to the address that the Senate's communication protocols listed for humanity's new diplomatic mission, which was a temporary office in a building in New York that had been repurposed for the purpose. The messages came from species across the Senate, small messages, careful messages, some of them barely more than acknowledgement of the agreement's existence, but they were there, and Amara, who read every one of them herself, recognized them for what they were: curiosity. For 2,000 years, the standard assumption of galactic politics had been that the KTH were the largest force and that everyone else organized themselves in relation to that fact. Now there was a new variable. The equation. A small blue one-moon planet that had told the largest military force in the known galaxy that whatever they just seen was a test run. The Senate species were watching. Some of them, she suspected, were hoping she read the last message of the day, set it down, and looked across the table at General Webb. We have 47 unread messages from non-Keth civilizations, she said. Some of them are from species that have been incorporated into the Empire but retain observer status in the Senate. Webb looked at her, reaching out. Yes. He was quiet for a moment, then phase 3. She looked at the stack of messages. 47 civilizations, 47 different history, 47 different relationships with the K-47 different reasons for sending a message to a planet that had just done something no one had expected. Not yet, she said, when she thought about the question. She thought about everything that had been built in 60 years of preparation, about the installations on the horizon, about the things still underground, still waiting, still not shown to anyone, about the gap between what the KTH had seen and what the K had not seen, about how that gap was the most powerful thing humanity had. When we know what we're walking into, she said, we made the first move. Already we don't rush the second. She picked up the first message and began to read. 6 months after the signing, humanity launched its first ship beyond the solar system. It was not the first ship that could have gone. That was an important distinction, and Amara made sure it was understood by everyone who needed to understand it. The first ship that was incapable of leaving the solar system had been ready for 11 years. It sat in a facility under the Atacama Desert and had been ready since before the K made first contact, before the intelligence analysts started decoding alien signals, before any of the current crisis had materialized. It had been waiting. Ship they launched publicly was smaller, a diplomatic vessel, clean lines, deliberately non-threatening profile. They named it First Step, which was a name that the xenolinguistics team had verified translated reasonably well into the 24 languages most likely to receive it. The launch was broadcast publicly on Earth and transmitted on every galactic frequency humanity had access to. The KE watched it from their monitoring stations. The Senate species watched it. 67 civilizations tracked a human ship leaving the gravity well of its home star for the first time, heading toward the nearest neutral station. The message that accompanied the launch was brief. Earth has entered the galaxy. We come as equals. We hope to find the same. The nearest neutral station was called Vithura. It had existed for 800 years, originally built as a trading post at the edge of what had been at that time explored space. Over the centuries, it had grown into something more complex, part trading hub, part diplomatic meeting ground, part information exchange. Hundreds of species passed through it every month. The KE maintained a presence there, as did most major civilizations. It was, in other words, exactly the right place to make an entrance. Ambassador Lena Vasquez commanded the First Step. She was 39 years old, a former UN diplomat who had worked for 12 years in conflict zones before transitioning to xenolinguistics research. When first contact became a real possibility, she spoke 11 languages fluently, was conversational in 6 more, and had a talent for reading rooms that had served her extremely well in environments where the wrong word at the wrong moment could end a negotiation or start a war. She docked at VTH Dara on a Tuesday, which was a concept that had no meaning to anyone at the station except her crew, but she noted it anyway. Out of habit, they were expected. That much was clear from the moment they cleared the docking bay. The station's main thoroughfare, a long wide corridor that connected the docking bays to the central hub, was not empty. Species she could identify from the briefing files were present in clusters, some pretending to go about their business, some not pretending at all. All of them were watching. She walked with her team at a measured pace, not rushed, not performing confidence, because the performance of confidence was a Different thing from the real version. And most species could tell the difference. She walked the way Amra had taught her to walk in these situations, like someone who has nowhere urgent to be because everywhere they go is exactly where they intended to be. The KTH presence at the station was significant. A garrison of approximately 200 personnel plus the diplomatic mission staff. Commander VTH Shan, who ran the station garrison, met her at the entrance to the central hub. He was military, not diplomatic. His expression was professionally neutral. Ambassador Vasquez, he said, welcome to VH Ra. Commander VTH Shan, she said, thank you for the welcome. A beat. I was briefed on the events at Earth. He said it was not a pleasantry, it was a statement of position. I know who you are and what happened. Most people in this part of the galaxy were, she said. Pleasantly, he held her gaze for a moment, then with the practiced smoothness of a soldier who had learned to read situations quickly, he stepped aside and gestured toward the hub. She walked past him. In the hub they had reserved a meeting room, standard diplomatic protocol. She set her team up, reviewed her schedule, and then, before any official meetings, walked out into the station's open market area. Alone, this was not in the protocol. Her security advisor had objected to it. She had overruled him. She wanted to be seen moving alone in the open without armor or escort in the first hours of humanity's first off-world diplomatic mission. She wanted that image to exist. She wanted it seen. She bought something from a food stall. It tasted like dried bark and mild pepper, which was not as bad as it sounded, and stood in the open space of the market and let herself be looked at. A small group of Lethis species she recognized from the briefing files, blue-green, four-armed, incorporated into the Cath Empire for roughly 200 years, stood at a distance watching her. They were trying not to stare. They were not succeeding. She looked at them and smiled, a real one. After a moment, one of them walked over, young by the look of it, with a bright coloring that the files associated with Lethis youth. It stood at what was probably a polite distance by its own culture standards and said something in a language she didn't know. Her translator handled it after a short delay. You are the human, one of them, she said. There are about 8 billion of us, give or take. The translator managed this. The young Lethis made a gesture she didn't have a file reference for. You fought the KE, it said. Yes, and they stopped. We reached an agreement, she said carefully. The Lethis made the gesture again. After a moment she decided it was probably the equivalent of a raised eyebrow, skeptical or maybe just curious. Our elders say nothing makes the Keth stop, it said. She thought about what to say to that. She had prepared many things to say in many situations. This particular situation, standing alone in an alien market on a space station, talking to a young member of a conquered species, had not been specifically scripted. She said, maybe they found something worth stopping for. The Lethis looked at her, then it made a third gesture, one she also didn't have a reference for, and walked back to its group. There was a brief, intense conversation she could not hear. Several of them kept glancing at her. She finished her dried bark food and went back to the meeting room. The official meetings began the following morning. In 3 days, Vasquez held 17 formal sessions with representatives from 9 different wheat species. Most of them were nominally there to discuss trade, frameworks and communication protocols. That was the surface purpose of the meetings. The real purpose was assessment both ways. She was being assessed by everyone she sat across from. They wanted to know what humanity was, whether the events at Earth were a fluke, a stroke of unusual luck, or something that represented a genuine shift in the power structure of the galaxy, and she was assessing them back. She was looking for the shape of the space humanity was entering, what the fault lines were, what the old grievances were, where the Keth were resented, where they were feared, where they had genuine support, what species were waiting quietly for change they didn't dare name out loud. She found more than she expected. The Lethis, formal representative, the elder of the station's diplomatic mission, very different from the young one she'd spoken to in the market, was careful and measured and said almost nothing of substance for the entire first meeting. But at the end of the session he stood and said, "Your Secretary General," she said. That was the beginning. What did she mean? Vasquez looked at him. She meant that the capabilities you saw during the engagement at Earth represented an early stage of our development. Early stage. He repeated, yes, he processed this. How early? She smiled the same way Amara had smiled at Kaoret, small already knowing the answer. We're an LT Uncan GT, young. She said, we're an LT Uncan GT, just getting started. He sat back down. He did not ask another question for the rest of the session. On the fourth day, the Keth requested a private meeting. Commander Beth Shan came himself without staff and asked for the meeting to be off record. She agreed to both conditions because agreeing to them cost nothing and denying them would cost something. They sat in the small room off the main corridor. He looked at her for a moment before speaking, which she had noticed was a KE habit in situations where they were uncertain of their ground. I want to ask you something directly, he said. Please do, the Secretary General said. The engagement at Earth was a test launch. Is that true? Yes. He leaned forward slightly. What were you testing? She had expected this question. She had prepared for it. The answer she had prepared was technically accurate and completely useless to him. Which was the point? Response times, she said. Point. Defense behavior, communication patterns between your ships under fire, sensor protocols, fleet cohesion under unexpected attack vectors. She paused. We learned a great deal. He was quiet. We also learned, she said, what we did not need to deploy to achieve the result we achieved, which was also useful information. Another silence. How much do you have? He asked, not aggressively. Genuinely, the question of someone who had been thinking about this for 6 months and had not found a satisfying answer. She looked at him. Commander, I think you already know. I'm not going to answer that. I know. A pause. I thought it was worth asking. She nodded. I understand. He stood, then at the door. He stopped. Your Secretary General, he said. She came to the negotiation as if she expected the outcome she got. She did because she knew what you had, because she trusted that what we had was sufficient. Vasquez said, there's a difference. He looked at her for a moment, turned it over, nodded once. Then he left. She sat alone in the room for a minute before going back to work, because she trusted that what we had was sufficient. The honest answer was slightly different. The honest answer was that Amara had done the math 60 different ways and reached the same conclusion every time, that even if the Keth refused to stop, even if they Pushed harder, there were enough layers of what humanity had built that the equation stayed the same, but the thing Shan needed to believe was not just that humanity had enough. He needed to believe that humanity knew it, that the confidence was not a performance, that when Amara stood in front of a fleet of 400 warships and said this was a test, she wasn't bluffing, and the truth, the actual complete truth, was that she wasn't. On the 7th day at Vera, Vasquez received a message from Amara. It was encoded in the new protocol they'd established, the one that used a rotating cipher system the cryptography team had spent 4 years developing. The KTH could intercept the signal. They could not read it. This was also in a small way a demonstration. The message was short. The Senate has formally requested an observer status hearing for Earth. They want to discuss the non-aggression framework and whether a new diplomatic classification is needed for a species that does not fit the existing categories. There is no category for what we are. They're going to have to make one. That's good. Come home first, we have work to do. Vasquez read the message twice. Then she looked out the small viewport in her quarters at the station's docking bay, and beyond it at the stars, a new category. She thought about what that meant about a 2,000-year-old Senate that had organized itself around a set of assumptions and what happened to those assumptions when something turned up that didn't fit them. About 67 civilizations reassessing their positions because one small blue planet had told the largest empire in the galaxy that the attack they had just witnessed was preliminary. About the 47 messages Amara had received about the Lethis Elder asking what the beginning meant, about Commander VTHN asking how much they had, about the fact that none of them knew, not really, not fully, and about the fact that humanity intended to keep it that way for as long as possible because the unknown was more powerful than the known, and they had learned that lesson the hard way across 5,000 years of doing it to each other. She closed the message. She started packing. They had work to do. The Senate observer status hearing was held on a station called Arel Marmora, which orbited a dim orange star at the edge of the second explored arm of the galaxy. Arel Mara was old, much older than Vithura. Its corridors had the quality of things built by many different hands, over many different centuries, additions and expansions and modifications, layered on top of each other until the original structure was buried somewhere. In the middle, it smelled like metal and old atmosphere and the accumulated residue of thousands of species passing through over 2,000 years. The Senate chamber itself was at the station's core, circular, 67 seats arranged in concentric rings around a central speaking floor. The ceiling was high enough that the upper rings were in partial shadow. It had been designed for a species that didn't exist anymore. The Vithura who had built the station originally, who had been the driving force behind the Senate's founding, who had died out 400 years ago from a cascading ecological failure on their home world. The Senate had kept the chamber in their design, a form of memory. Amara walked onto the speaking floor and looked up at 67 sets of eyes. Looking back at her, there were empty seats. Not all Senate species had sent representatives. Some were absent due to logistics, some due to political calculation, and some, she knew, because being seen at this hearing was a statement they were not yet ready to make. The KE delegation was present, 7 of them in the upper ring. Watching, she had been given 30 minutes. She used 22. She did not describe the battle at Earth in detail because they all knew it. She did not list humanity's capabilities because she was not going to do that. She did not make promises or threats. She spoke about what Earth wanted from the galaxy, which was the same thing humanity had wanted from its own world for most of its history and had only recently managed to achieve for longer than 75 years at a stretch. A stable framework, fair terms, the ability to exist without being told what it was allowed to be. She said, we are not asking for protection. We are not asking for preferential treatment. We are asking for recognition of what has existed since we were born, the fact that no other species owns us, no other civilization has authority over us, and no agreement we did not choose to enter can bind us. She looked at the Keth delegation. We have demonstrated that we take these principles seriously. Pause. We hope we do not have to demonstrate it again. She walked off the speaking floor. The vote was not what the Keth wanted. It was not, to be fair, everything humanity had wanted either. The Senate did not have a formal mechanism for granting full sovereign status to a new species. The existing framework had been built around the assumption that civilizations joined, either as members or as Keth incorporated territories with a few minor intermediate categories. Creating something new required a 2/3 majority and a formal amendment process that took months. What they granted instead was provisional sovereign observer status, which was a category that had never previously existed and which the legal committee had spent 3 weeks constructing specifically for this occasion. It meant in practice Earth was not incorporated. Earth was not classified. Earth could send representatives to Senate proceedings, could engage in bilateral negotiations with any species it chose, and could not be subjected to the KAT sovereignty agreement process without a full Senate review. It was not a perfect outcome. It was a wall between Earth and everything the KTH wanted to do, made from the Senate's own procedural structure. Amara accepted it. High Counselor Marin Voss watched the vote count come in from Aral Mora and said nothing for a full 2 minutes. Then she said, they're going to use this. No one in the room asked what she meant. They all knew the provisional status was a precedent. The legal framework that had been built around Earth could in theory be applied elsewhere. Species that were nominally incorporated into the empire but retain Senate observer positions could point to this framework, could ask questions, could use the Senate's own review process to complicate things. They planned this. Counselor Pethro said she had been saying variations of this sentence for 6 months, not the specific outcome but the shape of it. They moved toward the Senate because they knew what it would do. What it would do, Marin Voss said, is exactly what it was designed to do. The Senate was built to prevent any single civilization from unilateral domination, including us. A pause. We allowed it to exist because it was manageable, because no species has ever come in from outside and used it as a tool rather than a forum until now. Until now. She walked to the window of her office on KTH Prime. Outside, the capital city stretched to every horizon. 4,000 years of continuous civilization. The greatest empire the galaxy had Known, built piece by piece, world by world, always moving forward, always expanding. She thought about a small blue planet 11 light years away. She thought about the phrase Pithra had used in the first briefing, developed in a state of perpetual conflict. 5,000 years of continuous warfare, turning a species into something that looked soft and new, but wasn't, something that had learned every trick a civilization could learn, by trying them all on itself first, over and over, until the only ones left were the ones that actually worked. She thought about the 41 ships. What do they want? She said, not to anyone in particular. It was the question she kept returning to. It was, she had come to believe, the most important question. Not the immediate diplomatic objectives. What do they actually want? Pithro was quiet for a moment. I think, she said carefully, they want what every species that has ever reached space has wanted. To exist without looking over their shoulder. They don't look like they're looking over their shoulder. No, pause. They don't. 3 years passed. In that time, 6 species with incorporated status in the KTH Empire requested formal review of their classification under the new Senate framework. 2 of them cited the Earth precedent explicitly. None of the reviews succeeded in changing their status because the legal mechanism was new and slow, and the KE were experienced at working within Senate procedures, but the requests existed. They were on the record. Meanwhile, 3 human diplomatic missions established permanent presences at major Senate stations. Human trade agreements with non-Keth species grew from 0 to 47 in 36 months. First step was followed by 4 more vessels, then 10, then a permanent relay service between Earth and Aamora, and quietly, without announcement, the underground facilities on Earth kept running. General Webb retired after the 2nd year and was replaced by General Yuko Tanaka, who had spent the previous decade running the production oversight for the kinetic impactor program. She was small and precise and had a habit of answering questions about production capacity with numbers that she delivered in a tone that made it unclear whether they were reassuring or alarming. Most people who heard them felt both things simultaneously. She appeared at her first Senate briefing alongside Ambassador Vasquez, and the Keth intelligence officer in the room watched her and sent a report back to Keth Prime that said simply, the new one is also calm. In the 4th year, a KE border fleet encountered a human survey vessel in a region of space that both sides had unclear claims to. The survey vessel was not a warship. It was crewed by 7 people and equipped for geological and atmospheric analysis. It should have been, by any standard, a minor diplomatic incident. The border fleet commander sent a standard challenge. The survey vessel responded. The exchange was brief. The border fleet commander, you are in a region designated under KAT. Survey rights, state your authorization. The survey vessel, we are conducting geological survey under Earth's independent territorial assessment program. We have the relevant Senate documentation, transmitting now. Pause. While the documentation was reviewed, the border fleet commander, this documentation references provisional status category. It is not recognized under KE territorial law. The survey vessel, we understand we are operating under Senate framework. If there is a conflict, we suggest a Senate review process. We are happy to flag This for the next session, another. Pause. The border fleet commander had 40 ships. The survey vessel had 7 crew members. In a rock drill, he looked at his screens. He thought about the 41 ships. He thought about the briefings that had been circulating for 4 years about what humanity had and what it was still building and what had still not been shown to anyone. He thought about what the report would say if he filed it as an incident. He said, "We will flag it for Senate review. Thank you." The survey vessel said, "Safe travels." The border fleet moved on. Amr Azib Bansu retired 5 years after the signing. She gave a brief address at the UN before she left office, and the part that was most quoted afterward was the last part. She said, "We didn't win anything. We never thought of it as something to win. We built something over 60 years. Because our history taught us that the world does not become safe by hoping. It becomes safe by making it expensive to be unsafe. We made it expensive. We kept making it expensive, and we were patient, which is the hardest thing to be when the clock is running." She paused. "The galaxy is very large and very old, and most of it has decided what it is already. We haven't. We're still deciding. That's not a weakness. That's the whole advantage. An open question is harder to answer than a closed one. We intend to stay an open question for as long as possible." She stepped back from the podium. General Tanaka was in the audience. Vasquez was there by video link from Aral Mora, and in the upper gallery, in the seats reserved for diplomatic observers, an unusual presence at a domestic address was a Lethai's representative, young, bright coloring, the same one from the market at Vera. He had come a long way for a retirement speech. In the 10th year after the battle, the KTH Empire's Council of 12 convened a closed session on a topic that had not previously appeared on their formal agenda. Topic was strategic reassessment of expansion policy in light of the Earth situation. High Counselor Marin Voss was no longer on the council. She had retired 2 years prior. Her successor, Councillor Brems, opened the session by putting 3 numbers on the board. The first number was the current size of the human diplomatic presence in the galaxy. It had grown from 1 station to 23. The network they had built was functional, active, and deeply embedded in the Senate structure. The second number was the revised estimate of human production capacity. The intelligence division had updated it 3 times in the past decade. It kept being larger than the previous estimate. The third number was the count of species that had formally cited the Earth framework in their own status negotiations. 14, not all of them had succeeded. Some were still in process, but 14 species had looked at what Earth had done and decided to try the same approach. Most of them were small. Most of them had very little leverage. Most of them were going to lose, but they were trying, and they were trying because they had seen a template. They had seen that the answer to comply or face consequences was not automatically compliance. Brenvez looked at the council. The Earth situation, he said, has become something we did not anticipate. We anticipated a military problem. We encountered a military problem and resolved it at cost. What we did not anticipate was the cascade. He looked at the numbers. We resolved the military situation by recognizing their sovereignty. In doing so, we demonstrated that sovereignty was Something the Empire could recognize. 14. Species have taken note. A pause. What we are discussing today is not Earth. Specifically, Earth is a single planet. What we are discussing is what Earth represents, what it has communicated to every small incorporated or contested species in the Senate that there is. Another way to answer the question. The room was quiet. The question he continued is what we do about it. In the end, the KAT did not do what anyone expected. They did not escalate. They did not look for a way to quietly undo the Earth framework. They did not retaliate against the 14 species, invoking it, at least not in any way that could be formally documented. What they did was slower and more considered. They opened dialogue with Earth directly, not through Senate channels, not through diplomatic intermediaries. Direct channel proposed by the new Council and accepted by Earth's new Secretary General, a man named Kwam Asant, who had worked under Amara for 12 years and shared her particular brand of patience. The dialogue lasted 2 years. At the end of it, there was no grand treaty, no ceremony, no announcement that changed the formal structure of anything. What there was a working relationship, quiet, functional, built on the Keth understanding that humanity was not going away and was in fact getting larger, and on humanity's understanding that the K Empire had not survived 4,000 years by being stupid. It was not friendship, it was not alliance. It was something more durable than either. Two civilizations that had looked at each other clearly, calculated accurately, and chosen not to find out what the alternative looked like on Earth. In the facility 300 meters below the Nevada desert, the first ship that had been capable of leaving the solar system for 20 years was still there. General Tanaka visited it on a Thursday. She walked through the hangar, ran her hand along the hull, and stood under it for a while, looking up. It was much larger than the first step, much more capable. The systems it carried had no equivalent in any intelligence file held by any other civilization in the galaxy, because no intelligence asset had ever gotten close enough to see them. Her aide, standing at a respectful distance, said the Council's latest transmission came in this morning. They're requesting another round of capability discussions. Tanaka looked at the ship. Tell them we're still assessing the timeline, she said. The aide made a note. General, when are we actually planning to deploy this one? She looked at the hull for another moment, at the systems underneath it, at everything they had built and everything they had not yet shown, and everything that was still, after all these years, an open question. When we're ready, she said. She walked out of the hangar. The ship sat in the dark and waited, as it had always waited, as everything humanity had ever built for this moment had waited, patient, unshown, turning slowly from preparation into something the galaxy did not yet have a word for. Species that had learned from 5,000 years of teaching itself the hardest possible lessons, that the most dangerous thing in any room is not the largest thing, it is the thing that knows exactly what it is and has not yet decided to show